So what I'd like to do today is kind of cover, I guess, a bit of a provincial scope and where the frag problem right here in Essex County kind of fits in broader picture. Don't worry, you're not the only people dealing with this and pulling their hair out, because this is a big concern. Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada has called this Canada's worst invasive species. So this is a big concern. I'm going to talk about a few different invasive plants, and I'm going to highlight frag kind of as the keynote species, but this is not an, I guess, individualized system. We're going to talk about a few different species. So we're going to kind of kick it old school a little bit here. So I want to leave you folks with 4 different things I'd like to touch on, and hopefully if you can remember 1 or 2 of them when you're driving home tonight, then it's a success. But so I want to talk about our organization. I work for a nonprofit, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. Make you aware of some of the resources that we've produced on Phragmites and a couple other invasive plants that I think are really useful. I want to talk about Ontario's Invasive Species Act, which is kind of a really interesting, the most exciting thing to happen in frag since, well, probably the most exciting thing to happen in frag. I want to talk about some priority species and some ways to manage them. I guess I'm trying to speak to a few different people in the crowd tonight, right? But if invasive plants or invasive species are an issue to you as a property owner, or maybe you have a more conservation-oriented mindset, or maybe you're maintaining municipal ditches, I think I want to speak to a few different species and just kind of tie them in big picture. And then the last thing I want to talk about actually, this is the most exciting thing to happen in Phragmites control. A really interesting new tool in the toolboxes, as Ken alluded to before. An overwater herbicide application that happened in Ontario for the first time in Canada. So that's kind of a project I wanted to highlight at the bottom end. So those are the 4 things I'd like to cover today. And this is my quick 30-second commercial. I work for a nonprofit, so please indulge me. So I work for the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and we were formed in 2007, essentially viewing the problem being invasive plants. They kind of find a way, they're a bit of a quagmire issue. They find their way through many different government bodies, many different stakeholders. They don't really fall into one person's lap and you all of a sudden have to deal with them. They're really synergistic species or problem. So we were formed in 2007, essentially just to bring people together who are working on them. Academics, bringing those people together with land managers and everybody in between. So that's kind of the core goal of the organization I work for. We have a board of directors from all levels of government, municipal, federal, provincial. Academics are on, Indigenous groups, industry partners, NGOs. So that's kind of, we're looking at the issue of invasive plants and invasive species through not just a conservation mindset. OMAFRA is on our board, and Ministry of Natural Resources is also on our board. So kind of addressing this from or a few different angles. And so we do a lot of different projects. Essentially, like I said before, we're trying to take the interesting data collected by academics and interpret that and find a way to make it useful and accessible to the general public. So what we did to address that was we created a series of called Best Management Practices Guides. I've got a few on the table at the back if you'd like to take some home. For pretty much every priority invasive plant, or most invasive plants that are really causing people an issue, people want to actually deal with and manage, either on their property or just in their neighborhood. We have these guides. They're kind of the 30-page kind of idiot's guide to each species. So there's a few pages on kind of the background life history of some of these species, where they came from, how they got here, things like that. How do they reproduce? And then the real meat and potatoes part of each of these documents is how do we deal with it? What are all the different options that I can use to deal with it? Can I go out there and use a wet blade technique? Can I go out and spray herbicide? Should I go out and cut or mow? Can I hand pull these species? We're going to treat every species a little bit differently, but if you have a species on your property or that you're interested in trying to wade into controlling, this would be a really good first place to check out. So these are our best management practices libraries. They're available for free on our website, where there's a few copies at the back too of a few particular species. And there is a Phragmites one, but it was published in 2011, so it's been updated a little bit. We're tweaking, we're hopeful that it's getting better. The most current edition is going to be out in March 2017. So every couple years or every few years for this one, they're going to be updated and just make sure that the information is accurate. And a lot of the stories and information that we're conveying are stuff from Ken and Luann. So really good, people who are on the ground managing, that's the kind of nitty-gritty information we want in here. How much does it cost per kilometer stretch? Those kind of details are really important. So a few other products that we have that I think are useful to this conversation tonight. Here we have our Grow Me Instead guide, like Kevin pointed out. We have an invasive plant strategy framework document. It's kind of a guide for municipalities if you're interested in putting together kind of a collective stance on how do we address all invasive plants, new and established ones. This is a really nice guide to kind of get you thinking about what are the steps we can do to prevent new species and what is the general approach we can take to managing all invasive plants. And there's a workshop coming up in this region a little bit later in the year, so if you'd like more on that, please let me know. And then our clean equipment protocol, I think it's relevant to the Phragmites conversation. It's available at the back. We're finding Phrag, it can spread by seeds and also by root structures, by rhizomes, by plant material. So what we did is we created this guide. It's again about 30 pages or so, and it's the kind of thing that you can staple to a tender or a contract if you're having somebody manage property. And it's just a bit of a checklist, basically. A really essential version of it is that it's just a checklist to have you check this part of equipment. This is where invasive plant material generally tends to kind of hide. So when you're addressing one part of property and you're moving across the road or down the road or to a different municipality in the afternoon, hopefully you don't take that stuff with you. So those are some of the products that we have, but by far our most important document is our coloring book, and adult coloring is all the rage, so don't be scared to pick one up at the back there for you or grandkids or you. Feel free to grab one. But just kind of a fun way for us to start the conversation about invasive plants with a very different audience. As you can tell, we're trying to focus on a few different groups or segments of the population here, right? We're looking at horticulture as being an interesting pathway. We're looking at heavy equipment operators as being another part of the solution. We're looking at kids too, just the point that Ken made off the bat. So that was my commercial. It was a little bit longer than 30 seconds, but that's what I wanted to get across. I think it's all very useful information to this conversation. The second thing I wanted to get across here is that we have an Invasive Species Act. Did anybody know that we have an Invasive Species Act? Okay, so we are the first province in Ontario, first province in Canada to have a standalone piece of legislation for addressing invasive species. And the so what, why does that matter at all, is because invasive species can be legally bought and sold in Ontario, which seems a little bit backwards, right? We were talking before about Phragmites. That's one of the pathways that it came in, was that it's a beautiful ornamental plant. And so too is an invasive aquatic plant, water soldier, still actively bought and sold, or has been. So this legislation was designed with really trying to address a few of those problems, but this one in particular is that we didn't really have something with a whole lot of teeth to address these new species coming in. So that was a really big challenge that we saw. So this Invasive Species Act is going to do a few different things, but one of the things is it's going to limit the ability to sell certain species, not all species, but particular isolated species. So that's very interesting, I think. It's as interesting as legislation gets to me, frankly. But this legislation, the kind of major takeaway here is that there's going to be there are two categories of groups of species, collective units of species. So there's species that are going to be called prohibited species. So essentially what that means are that's the regulation that are going to have a whole lot of teeth to it. So again, you can't buy these species, you can't sell these species, you can't transport or possess these species. These are the really highly problematic species. So a good example of a species that would be thrown into that group would be something like Asian carps. If you've seen the YouTube videos of those jumping carps, the really large carp, they're not in Ontario yet, but they're kind of coming up the Mississippi and knocking on the Great Lakes door. That would be a high priority species that would fall into this prohibited category. So species that are identified certainly as risks, but not quite as potentially damaging, those would fall into this group down here, restricted species. So a little bit less teeth on the regulations. So those are species that you can't bring into Ontario parks. You can't bring them into conservation reserves. You can't willfully just possess them or dispose of them in natural areas. So not as many teeth, not as much teeth as these prohibited species, the high priority ones. That would be like the Asian carp. But something down here that's going to be a restricted species. Oh, there we go. Would be Phragmites and a few others. So back in September, this was the first time, we knew that this Invasive Species Act was coming down the pipeline. But in September 2016 was the first time we actually found out what these species are going to be in Wave 1. So we have this act, we have these regulations associated with it, but we didn't know what species would fall into what categories. So in September was the first time we started to hear what species the provincial government was thinking about. So this was really nice to see. In terms of these prohibited or these really teethy regulations here, we had all the different species of Asian carps. There's a few different species that are actually called Asian carp. We also had some aquatic plants that were really high risk, so things like hydrilla, things like water soldier. So these are the regulations here that were going to be prohibit the sale and trade of these species. Now the other group here that restricted, it's a little bit of a smaller list, but this is where my wheelhouse is, being a bit of a plant person. So 3 species fell into this category, or are going to be falling into this category. We have Phragmites of note tonight. We have Japanese knotweed, and we have dog strangling vine. So there's going to be some more action on these 3 species in particular in the province. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about them before we head home tonight, because I think they're really interesting and really great examples. Dog strangling vine, that's it in action. This is Japanese knotweed, and that, as we all know, is Phragmites. So dog strangling vine, as far as I know, has yet to strangle a dog. This is us just putting in the scare tactics. This is a totally set up image here. But aside from not strangling dogs, it does have really serious negative consequences on our environment. So this fellow here is standing in a nice pine plantation, not far from Peterborough. It's not too far from Peterborough, and I mean, a pine plantation is a very modified landscape. It's not exactly that pristine wilderness by any means, but nonetheless, all we're seeing here, that's that senesced dead material on the ground, that's just 100% cover of dog strangling vine. So in this forest, or in this natural space, we're looking at a species richness, or a number of species of 2. We're looking at a nice pine plantation and just dog strangling vine in the understory. So really nasty, thick, dense colony. Really nice looking flowers here. Is everybody familiar with this plant? Do we have? Yeah? Okay. So it's got these 5-part pink flowers here. Kind of looks like a starfish. And it looks a lot like some of our native milkweeds. And it looks so closely related to them that monarch butterflies, they can't tell the difference between the 2. So they'll go and lay their eggs on dog strangling vine thinking that it's the native plant, the very beneficial host-specific plant, milkweeds. They'll lay their eggs on these guys here, and basically that's bad news. We have no examples of eggs being laid on this invasive plant here, turning into mature reproductive monarch butterflies. So, there's a few different reasons why invasive species can become an issue, whether it's how we move water in our landscape, or from a biodiversity perspective, or an economic perspective. There's many different ways to evaluate this situation, but I think it's interesting to look at it that way. So what I'd like to do is I want to talk about these 3 species. If you have these species on your property, or if you're interested in kind of getting them out of a park nearby, or something like that, what I wanted to do is kind of give you the BMP rundown, or tell you how our BMP would be used for each species. So what our BMPs, our Best Management Practices Guides, do are they evaluate all of the different potential options, and ultimately they kind of push you in the direction of what technique you'd probably want to use based on your situation. So digging for dog strangling vine can be really effective. It's great if you've got 1 or 10 or 20 plants, but if we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and acres of plants, clearly you're not going to be digging it all out. So we kind of guide you through that, tell you the pros and cons associated with that. Clipping, that can be really interesting. If you go out and just kind of chop the plants off at the base, that can actually be far worse. You're doing more harm than good at this point. It's kind of a bit of a Medusa plant. If you cut it off once, it'll grow back 3 or 4 different shoots, and it can actually increase its seed set as a result of that. So the plant kind of goes into panic mode, says, oh my gosh, I'm under attack here, I better reproduce as quickly as possible, as frequently as possible, and it will produce even far more seeds. So this kind of, our BMP would suggest to you that clipping is not a great idea if you want to manage this. You can go out and pick the seed pods. Again, frankly, if we're talking about hundreds of plants, that's not realistic. So our BMP would kind of continue to guide you through some of these here. Mowing can be effective if you're doing it up to 4 times a year. That would be helpful. If you're doing it once or twice, it's that kind of same impact, that you're clipping the plants off maybe once a year, and it's just going into panic mode and throwing out even more above ground material. And tarping can also be an interesting approach to dealing with this here. It's not selective. You're kind of killing everything that you see. but this can be one way of managing this invasive plant. So some of our most preferred for dog strangling vine, we don't like to recommend chemical control for necessarily every species at all, but ultimately this is kind of one of the heavy hitters that frankly it just merits the biggest tools in our toolbox. So chemical control, this like Phragmites is not just a one-time approach. Multi-visits would be the best way to deal with it. And we only have one product, again, thinking back to that, how many tools do we have in the toolbox here? For dog strangling vine, there's only one actual registered product that we can use to control it. So it's a bit challenging. So this is a really challenging species across the province. People are really having a hard time dealing with this for a few reasons. It spreads really quickly, much like Phragmites. It can also form those dense monocultures, areas of just one species, much like Phragmites. So the next species I want to talk about is Japanese knotweed. So this species was an intentional introduction. Again, I talked before about horticulture being kind of one of the partners in the solution here. This was brought over intentionally, largely because it reproduces very quickly and forms really nice fences. So if you don't have the best of neighbors, 50 years ago this would have been a great plant to plant in between you. Really, really dense, really hard to see through this, really nasty. Now it's got really robust, strong, dense root structures. And that's one of the reasons why when we were doing ecological restoration projects 30, 40, and 50 years ago in the province, we were suggesting this is a great species to plant in our riparian zone. So an area right beside a stream where we're concerned about soil erosion, this was kind of our go-to species. And we've kind of put ourselves in an interesting situation now because frankly it's so good at what it does that we're having a hard time getting it out now. So really dense root structures, really strong. They can grow up through asphalt, which is really quite shocking to see. They don't respond well to mowing at all, but really problematic species. So what are the options? The BMP would kind of guide you through that decision process again. So mowing and cutting, they can be reasonably effective if you're doing them regularly in particular. Every month in the summer seems to be a reasonable cutting regime to do. And they can really knock back the population, maybe not eradicate the entire population. Digging out can be great. I mean, if you only have a very small contained patch that's a relative new introduction, then that can be a really effective way to deal with it. If it's a larger patch that's beyond the scope. Some municipalities are having to use excavation material or excavation equipment to dig it out. You can see this plant go down as deep as 6 meters, the root structures. So if you don't get all of the roots, it can grow back. So the city of Thunder Bay, they just did a small little pilot project. This is the first time they'd managed it. They had to bring in an excavator. They kind of hit it with everything they had. And the contractor didn't go down. I think the project was kind of a quick turnaround project. I think they ended up going down just below 1 meter, and we've seen regrowth already. So it's kind of a shame to see it coming back, but this is a really interesting plant. Phragmites, the root structures are pretty prolific, but nothing like this guy. So excavating, I mean, where do you put all that contaminated fill is a huge problem. Where do you get enough clean fill to kind of deal with that big hole you've put in a municipal park? So this excavating might not be the kind of tool for you. Chemical control can be used, if you can combine it, like what we're talking about, we were talking about wet bleed. That's a great approach because it's using integrated pest management. It's using a couple different tools at once, right? We're kind of weakening the plant by cutting it, and then we're also hitting it with herbicide at the same time. This can be a really effective way to deal with this guy here by going in and doing a mow and then a chemical control treatment after that. That can be a really effective way of dealing with it. But it really just depends on your objectives, and the BMP kind of guides you through that thought process. What are your resources? Or is it you and a shovel, and maybe the kids? Or are you a municipality with access to something like this? So the star of the evening is Phragmites. And I said before, the federal government has determined this is Canada's worst invasive species. I don't know how they came to that conclusion, if it was like a big reveal contest or something like this, or a game show, but ultimately this is really bad news. And it's bad news from a biodiversity perspective. We see those dense monocultures of nothing but Phragmites. It's bad news from an economic perspective and how we're moving water throughout our watersheds. There's no shortage of examples of why this isn't the greatest plant ever. So mowing is ineffective. So our BMP does not advise to mow. This is not a good approach. Just kind of, you're cutting grass basically. It's coming back and coming back. And we've actually seen a few examples where repeated mowing on the same patch can actually change like the life history or the kind of inner workings of the species. So instead of growing to that 18, 20 feet kind of range and then popping out seed heads on top, we can actually see it kind of reach flowering much, much quicker. So we're seeing some interesting kind of relationships between how we're treating it and how it's reacting. So mowing, the BMP says this is not a great option. Mowing alone. Chemical control, it can be really effective. We've seen a few great examples of that. There's different ways to deal with this. We've seen boom spraying to be effective. We've seen hand wicking to be effective. If we have a conservation project where there's really just a few stems of Phragmites, maybe it's a new introduction to an area, or maybe it's interspersed with some really high priority species that we're interested from a conservation perspective. That can be a very targeted way to deal with it. So, different tools, different ways to manage the species. By no means do we have all the final answers on what is the best approach, but with folks like Luann and Ken kind of contributing to this conversation, as well as a number of others, we're starting to kind of really fine-tune how we're dealing with it, what tools we're using under what circumstances. So I guess this would be a little bit more conservation-oriented, obviously, not so much a landscape perspective, but if you at the cottage perhaps have frag starting to come onto your shoreline and causing you concern, this is a really interesting technique that's just starting to be wider used, I guess, within the last 2 years. So it's called spading. If you have a shovel, you can spade, no problem. Essentially, it's just digging the plant out at a very particular spot. So right below the surface, it's going to require multiple treatments, but within 2 or 3 years, we can really start to see great results using spading. So there's been a couple sites, and this was published out of Wimblewood Beach by Lynn Short. We're seeing some really nice results. So again, if your issue with frag is on a more contained, more localized problem, just in front of your shoreline, or maybe even in front of your property in town, then this might be the kind of technique for you. So we talked about before, and I'm going to contradict myself in a second, but there's no chemical control options in standing water. We've kind of heard that, and that's the issue with the toolbox is limited right now. If you have standing water and Phragmites, these are two things that don't get along very well in terms of trying to manage it. So there aren't a lot of great perfect options. There's nothing that we can go and hit it that's energy efficient and resource efficient, I guess, and deal with it within 1 or 2 years. It's the kind of battle that's going to take a few years. But there's a group called Georgian Bay Forever, and they've published this method here. And basically, it's just going at it. The idea's been around for a little while, but this is the first time they're trying to scale up the concept and make it easy for people to actually do. And so basically, what it is, it's a steel trimmer, and it's got kind of a hedge trimming blade on the end. And they treat it with natural oil. Usually they're using canola oil, and just to keep it lubricated. And they're submerging that below the surface of the water, and they're cutting it just below the surface of the water, as far down to the roots as they can get. But usually there's a bit of the root stock. And so they're trimming it right down as low as they can go. And basically the ratio is like 1 person cutting to like 9 people carting the plant material out. It's not an easy job to do, but these are people that this is the issue in front of their cottage on Georgian Bay, and this is how they're choosing to deal with it. And they are having positive results. Again, this is not something we can hit with 1 year, 2 year, even 3 years. But longer term, we're starting to see some really good results. We're seeing the patch shrink. We're winning, like was mentioned before. So carting the material off is an issue for these guys, but basically they have 1 person cutting, and then they'll have somebody kind of collecting right in the thick of this here, and basically just bundling them up onto little floaty racks and kind of finding their way out of the property. So again, this is not kind of a huge scalable idea, but if it's you and your cottage association, or you and the next door neighbor, or even just you individually, this is one way that we can see positive results in aquatic environments, a really challenging habitat to work in frag control. Now, like we've seen before, if you're outside, if you're in a dry area, we've got some tools in the toolbox here. And so we're really starting to see this method become a little bit more refined. We're seeing late fall or winter mows. We're seeing summer sprays, and then we're seeing them remove biomass by using prescribed burning. So there's different, it depends on your resources, it depends on your project. Are you a natural resources oriented project or not? That can ultimately change how you're going to address dealing with frag, but one of the best ways is kind of a bit of that integrated pest management, that combination approach of using a few different things, kind of mowing or rolling over the material, cutting it down You're trying to spray that new regrowth, and then ideally by removing as much, whether that's through fire, whether that's through actually harvesting the material out, but removing as much of that plant material as possible has really positive effects on the native community recovery. So it's really not just about getting rid of this, but it's also about thinking, well, what's going to replace it, and how can we kind of build in some resiliency? So this is where, in terms of natural resource management, this is where a lot of the conversation's starting to go to, is how can we kind of fine tune this when we mow? Do we move the material off-site or not? Do we leave it on-site? Kind of these finer tuning things are really starting to kind of pay dividends. The species I wanted to highlight, and the last thing I wanted to do here is share you some work that's not mine, because that's the easiest way to do things. We just had, last week, I said before, there's one of the most interesting things that's happening here in Ontario is that we're starting to see frag control in aquatic environments for the first time with chemicals. So this was on a pilot basis. This is not for wide-scale use, but we're trying to get to that point where hopefully we can lobby hard enough that we can get that tool in our toolbox. Many of our neighbors to the south in the States, on a state-by-state basis, they have access to different herbicides and different chemicals they can use in aquatic environments. We just don't have that in Canada yet, and we don't have that in Ontario yet. So basically, that's kind of the goal of this project here, is on a small-scale pilot basis. Let's try this idea out and see if we can ultimately get to the point down the road where hopefully we can implement this on a broader scale so that everybody can have access to these tools if we can prove that they're effective. So about a week ago, this project happened this year. I'll show you the timeline in a minute, but in September was when in Long Point and Rondeau, there was an emergency use kind of pilot trial that happened on Phragmites control in the provincial parks there. And so that happened in September and into October, and so we're starting to see some interesting data from that. This is the first time this has happened in Canada. It's the first time it's happened in Ontario, dealing with Phragmites with herbicides in aquatic environments, in standing water. So the results aren't in yet, but about a week ago we had the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry present on this in 30 minutes in an online webinar, and it's available for free. So this is me kind of regurgitating the information that they have taught us and brought into us, and the results that they've shared with us. If you'd like it straight from their mouth, please feel free to check out our website, and it's posted for free. You can check it out. You can fact check me if you'd like. But it's ontarioinvasiveplants.ca/what-we-do-training. And you'll see it there. It's called the Long Point and Rondeau Emergency Use Project. So what I'm going to do is just present kind of just some of the how they did this, because I think it's really interesting. It's operating on a different scale than any other invasive species control project that we've had in Ontario. So I just wanted to share some of this with you. So again, these are their slides that I've just brought here today. So don't blame me if there's any spelling typos. But so basically, why we were doing these is because they're globally recognized habitats. So Centers for Biodiversity in the province, coastal wetlands on a Great Lake, this is a really big issue, and they're being overrun with frag. And they basically view this as a tipping point. So there's been frag control in terrestrial environments for quite a while now there. They've spent an awful lot of time and resources and effort going into dealing with this challenge. A lot of species at risk there, 23 species at risk if you combine both of the properties together. So this is the kind of, this is the why this is such an issue and why it merits. So again, all this information is on the webinar, but I just wanted to share some of the most pressing features of it with you. So the project started back in March 2015, and where we are now is kind of right at the end date. We're at the monitoring and reporting phase of the whole project. So in September this year is really when all the action happened. All the updates are posted kind of in a sequential day-by-day breakdown or multi-day-by-day breakdown on the Ontario Phragmites Working Group website. So if you're kind of interested in how this played out on the ground, that's a really good resource if you'd like to check that out. But basically in September, contractors were brought in September this year, and aerial applications of Phragmites was dealt with. There was also kind of corresponding terrestrial efforts that were happening at the same time, or on the same properties, I should say. So they're kind of working hand in hand here. And this is the cool part. This is how they dealt with it. So there was aerial applications, helicopter spraying. And if you're kind of if this excites you, helicopter application of herbicides to invasive plants, there's videos of how they were loading these up. So basically they had a rig right beside the application area. They would come in, land on the back of the truck, fill up, fly off, and go and actually spray the selected area. They were doing this with GPS tracking, so these were very highly targeted. The maps are available, again, through this webinar if you'd like to see exactly where they were and where they weren't. You know, really interesting precision in terms of where they're able to spray. And if you're wondering, well, how much does this cost? They address that in the webinar as well. I think it's really interesting. So the helicopter costs $6,000 a day to rent. And in terms of how much does it cost per acre to treat, about $100 in product cost alone. So we're treating areas that you couldn't access through any other application technique. Really effective. The spraying went on for I guess probably about a week or week and a half of actual application days. So really effective, really interesting results. It's gone. And so the data hasn't come in yet in terms of actually trying to quantify the impact, but I think this picture, or the picture in the webinar, I guess, is kind of hard to differentiate. It kind of tells what we're looking at here. So we're looking at a very hard line here of where they started treating and stopped treating. Over on the right, I hope you can take my word for it, this is all yellow material here. This is where they had sprayed. This is just a few days after actually treating. And then on the left here, this is an untreated terrestrial area that hadn't been treated yet. So really stark contrasting differences. So this is kind of the proof of concept. We're seeing interesting results. Actual quantifiable data should be coming in by the end of the year for reporting, or early into the next year, but at least just in terms of visually, this is starting to look really promising. So really exciting to see that.